thank you, Porochista, for coming along. I really, really appreciate it. I'm so excited to have you here. I'm like literally like having a fangirl moment. So thank you. And I've read a lot of your work, but obviously I'm going to delve into one book in particular today, but doing a quick introduction and then we'll get straight into it because I have like 100 million questions. So Porochista Khakpour was born in Tehran and raised in the greater Los Angeles area. She has been awarded fellowships from the Johns Hopkins University Writing Seminars, Northwestern University, the Sewanee Writers Conference, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, the Ucross Foundation, and Yaddo, along with like so many others. Her work has even been nominated for several Pushcart Prizes. Porochista is the author of 4 books, including Brown Album, The Last Illusion, and Suns and Other Flammable Objects. Her first memoir, Sick, is a memoir of chronic illness, misdiagnosis, addiction, and the myth of full recovery, chronicling the long, arduous discovery of her late-stage Lyme disease. So, Porochista, I've got to ask you, when were you actually first properly diagnosed with Lyme disease?
Yeah, that's quite a complicated question because I had been diagnosed a few times because, there's acute Lyme and then there's like chronic Lyme. The chronic Lyme and late stage Lyme is a more controversial diagnosis. So on an acute level, I was diagnosed, I think, first in like 2009 when I was a visiting professor in Pennsylvania. And I had a partner who was actually from Connecticut, where it was the sort of home of Lyme in America. And he noticed a bug bite on me. And so then I actually was sent to the hospital and they were like, oh, this could be it. And I did test positive. But it was sort of like the thing in 2009, okay, you'll just take a couple of weeks antibiotics, you'll be fine. It was really unclear because after that I had all sorts of health issues, but really prior to that, 2006, I'd had some mysterious health issues. And, my book Sick kind of looks at the fact that like throughout my life, I'd had health issues. Even before that, that because you're dealing with like an atypical, even that word is strange here, but an atypical body or somebody who had come to the US in sort of strange circumstances, through, wartime and then come into circumstances of like poverty so that like I didn't really have access to, my parents came here during the war, but there was the sense that America would offer a better life, but it wasn't the case. And so I didn't really get to go to the like sort of doctors that most people went to. And there was really no discussion of exploring my health. Even as like a teenager, I would faint or I had problems with my weight. I had tremors, lots of weird things. So there, 2009 was kind of the first time I really heard it in a doctor's setting. There'd been a little bit of a talk of it in 2006. And then really when my treatment began for it and I got really advanced testing, the sort of testing that costs thousands and thousands of dollars, where they look really deeply at the nature of the illness and the co-infections, that was 2012.
Wow.
So not that long ago, less than a decade ago. And that's when, and then since then I've had some serious relapses from that. And I never test negative for it, even now. So there's no getting rid of it. So that's why when people ask me like, are you okay now with Lyme? It's like, I'm not asymptomatic anymore, but I think if you were to give me the same advantage, because it's very expensive still to afford those tests. My doctors don't see any reason to repeat them because probably it's going to come out positive again.
Right, God, that's a long journey with Lyme indeed. And God, I was reading and it just sounded so frustrating, like going through that. And it was really interesting, like how you opened the book with that email to your friends and colleagues. And I was just wondering, like, how did it first feel to actually open up and talk about your health with your friends and things like that?
Well, I felt like I couldn't afford to not do it. I was like a single woman with a dog. And when I would get very sick, New York is such that people are very independent here. And sometimes you don't see your good friends for like many months at a time. There's some dear friends I have that I haven't seen in like over a year right now. So that when I had to compose that was kind of like my doctor and different health advocates saying like, whenever you start to feel sick, let people know, because people here will just assume if they haven't heard from you that you're just busy with work, which I was. But at the same time, I lived in Harlem. I have friends in my building in the community, but not like close friends really, just like neighbors who saw me all the time. And so, people that, would check in, but they weren't like able to check in all the time, or they didn't really have an understanding of my history. They would see me suddenly with a cane or stumbling on the street. It was just a little unclear. And so I wrote that email is like exactly the email that I sent my friends, just cut and paste. And, I had become very good at that point of sending mass emails. And I also felt like with a mass email, what's nice about that is that you're telling people, I'm not just relying on one person. Like, here's a network of people, so I'm not putting the burden on you. And I always wanted people to reply all, so people would know that there's someone else checking on me, because I knew my friends would always feel this like profound sense of guilt if they couldn't be there. And you can't really blame somebody like if they can't be there. I mean, with COVID, we're now seeing this problem too, of course, in a different way, because people sometimes can't be face to face because of the contagiousness of the disease. Lyme is less contagious, of course, or it's not contagious really in the same way, but it's still like getting help in a broken healthcare system in capitalist America is quite a difficult thing if you're an unmarried, single adult. So yeah, that's where those emails came in, and there were many more of those. And that situation was especially bad because around that period, I also had like a concussion. Usually was always some other triggering event on top of the Lyme disease that was complicating it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it was really interesting to read that, you'd met people with Lyme before, you got your official diagnosis, and I guess it's always different, isn't it, when you don't have it at the time. But then how was it like when you met people after you were diagnosed with the condition? Did it feel like suddenly there was like somewhat of a solidarity movement?
I thought there could be, but I'm not sure if there was really. I mean, I still struggle a little bit with who the Lyme communities are in the US. I had to leave like a New York Lyme group. And just recently I was asked to film a PSA for Lyme, and then for whatever reason, my recording wasn't used. And I looked, it was just a bunch of white people. And I think Lyme in America, in the East Coast mostly, is just extremely wealthy, very affluent white people. And they're not really my type of people, because they also tend to be more conservative in their politics. So a lot of the, anti-vaxxers and COVID truthers and all these people like that they're all over our Lyme community. So I don't really, they might like me, or they might rate me and like I'm their token POC person that they can feel okay about supporting. But I don't really see them as my community. And I'm very open with that. I'm extremely open with, everything really, including my animosities. And so, well, I don't really think I can't at my age, 43 now, be fake about anything anymore. I just find it such a waste of time. And like people who run away from the truth or who are insincere, to me, just like waste everybody's time. So I just like, even if it's uncomfortable, I'm very open with like letting someone know that like, yeah, you and I do not see eye to eye, and I don't want to see eye to eye. I don't want to be in the same room as you. The Lyme community doesn't love hearing that sometimes, but I don't really care because frankly, I don't care. But rich people don't seem to really care often, and so their empathy is like sort of like, disabled. Well, I hate to use the word disabled there, but in a sense it is. And so I feel that our communities are not what they should be, because we know Lyme, like all other conditions, affects communities of color disproportionately because of, economics, basically. And so it's just, yeah, these people did appear, they came to my readings. I suddenly had readings where like books were sold out and huge crowds, and the book earned out. So I'm grateful that it got readers and all that, but I'm not always sure. I actually talked to my editor about this a few months ago. I said, I'm not always sure the audience I got for the book was the audience I hoped for, which is really like a book that I hoped women of color could read. And I think women of color with chronic illness have read it, thankfully. But as usual, I think like, I would look out into an audience and I would just see these sort of like a certain type of white woman who I don't want to just immediately prejudge as like being like adversarial to me, but you know, it wasn't a surprise, let's just say, in the Q&As at those events that I could see some of these people were very conservative, or you know, it's important for them to also set themselves as apart from me. So
yeah, it's a shame, but I'm like, it's tough, isn't it? Because like I identify as disabled now, and I was just wondering, like, how did you forge and embrace your identity as an Iranian, you know, American Muslim woman of color with a chronic health condition?
Yeah, so many boxes are checked. You've got queerness on top of that. It's like a
And
lot. Yeah,
queerness, yeah.
I just don't really like. I find it overwhelming. Actually, I think some people like bigots feel like, oh, you get to check off every box. Like, I don't want to check off all these boxes. It doesn't make my life easier. But I think it took me a long time to embrace like chronic illness and disability, because I would go in and out of flares. So at times I didn't really feel chronically ill and disabled, and I felt awkward saying I was, but then, you know, more times of the year I was in flares. So then I sort of had to examine my own ableism, like what is the reason that I'm like hesitant to say that? Do I not want, like, is there some reason I don't want to be seen as part of this community? I mean, I think ableism is just such a huge problem. So
Yeah.
I don't totally fault my younger self for being hesitant there, but I think it's a very important category to embrace, actually, because, well, you can see with COVID, I mean, more and more people are going to experience illness and disability in their lives, like way before they thought they would. And so it will actually has a great potential to unify more people than people think. But it also, I think, is one of those areas where ableism is so potent that it really challenges how people navigate this particular category of identity. You know, it really is complicated. So, and again, you don't have communities with great solidarity either. These communities have very different issues. And so it's very hard to, like, you know, unify somebody with, like, you know, I don't know, like a person who's blind doesn't have that much in common with somebody that has like lupus, you know, and so these are all just very dramatically different issues. So it's very hard to try to, like, you know, create this one movement when there's such different tiers and different, you know, factors.
Oh God, yeah. I kind of see it as like a trade union that just encompasses all industries, and it's just like, oh wow, too many issues. Maybe a unifying kind of goal, but it's like just a mess of stuff, isn't it?
And I know
so
tons of people that have disability and illness, but they don't want to say they do. So I don't know what to do with all those people. But
definitely,
I have
like
tons.
the invisible ones.
I think most the people I know have chronic illness and disability, but some of them are still not ready to say it.
Definitely. And, you know, I guess, you know, you mentioned this in your book, which is like the medical system, I guess, did not treat you well at all. And that's why I was just wondering, like, what is your relationship with the medical system now? And what do you think needs changing?
Well, I got better in 2018, 2019 because of getting to good doctors through a crowdfund, really, here in New York. And I mean, the doctor that I have, my main MD, who kind of handles all the specialists and different types of treatment, I mean, he is like a doctor that sees like Bella Hadid, you know, he's like celebrities, like he's the top doctor you could really see. I've been to numerous top doctors for Lyme disease, mostly because of crowdfunds, because these are not people that take regular health insurance, though my current one does do testing through regular health insurance, but for the most part, it's really thousands and thousands of dollars anytime you go to see these types of doctors. So I got better because, so it's actually, I think it's very possible to get better if you can afford it. That's why celebrities, you'll hear like, oh, I have Lyme, and then they get better. Because if you throw enough money at Lyme disease, there's a way to live with it. That's the sad truth. But if I hadn't, then it would be a really different story. So, you know, yeah, like currently I have like a good system with a bunch of good, I have doctors actually all over the country. Like if I were to move to LA or San Francisco or Santa Fe, or I have doctors, and so many people are now aware of my book that, you know, the doctors presumably if times have, or I don't know, I guess a few times have let me skip in line, or they've been interested to meet me, which really is also a mess. Like, why would it be more important to meet me just because I wrote a book about it? But, doctors, I guess, are like other people, but like, it's just, yeah, I mean, the ableism never really stops, but my access to like proper healthcare is definitely, I've definitely seen evidence that if you throw enough money at the thing, it gets better.
Yeah.
It doesn't go away though, but you can live with it.
Yeah.
But you have to continually throw money at it. So that's also changes my, like I don't really have a life where I consider buying a house. Whereas I think so many people have that as a goal. No, for me, any spare money like that will go to illness. Always.
Yeah.
So, or like I have to spend extra money on supplements and groceries of a certain sort that normally I wouldn't really have to think about, because I have to stay on top of my health or else it can get all messed up again.
See, this is where we have privilege here, having our health system.
Yeah.
Hugely, I'm really grateful to it. And, just reading, especially I find like as a woman of color, how did it feel to be like continually dismissed by doctors?
I guess the thing is, I wasn't so surprised by it because I've been, dismissed on different like levels with different aspects of my identity. So I guess like walking into a doctor's office, like a white guy, I wasn't that surprised. Even in the early days of it, I kind of knew that was coming, but it didn't make it any easier, really. It's like just because you're prepared doesn't mean it's like gonna truly soften the blow. But it was just really just exhausting. It was just logistically problematic because I would have these very short windows for treatment before shit would really hit the fan physically. And the doctors knew that too, but the system couldn't operate swiftly enough or appropriately enough so that I could get better. So it was always like, I always felt like I was chasing something and I was always behind. And so, even when I knew what to do treatment wise, sometimes I couldn't afford it. So there's always some like pretty heartbreaking negotiation where it's almost like I would know exactly what needed to be done, but then I couldn't make it happen. So and like some of these waiting lists with doctors, that was a big problem itself. And, so many of the treatments ended up being, actually, I mean, in 2018, 2019, a lot of the most conventional treatments actually ended up working for me. But in the past, I'd had to resort to what was seen as experimental therapies, the ones that are seen as mainstream in Europe and in Asia. So things that if I lived in Germany would have been no issue. But here, because of how the CDC and the FDA is, like, these things were really problematic here and seen as like wacky alternative health stuff. And so, and that, it's not really fun to get experimental therapies either. I think people sometimes mistakenly think like, oh, must be much better, but it's actually very nerve-wracking, like, some of the stuff you have to do. So yeah, no, it was like just a very frustrating journey and with a lot of errors. That's the other thing. There's a lot of doctor errors. And sometimes those errors were based on like them misunderstanding me. And so then there was this additional burden of like, you have to present yourself and the case really well in that short bit of time you're given. And, and I'd have friends come with me, but sometimes the friends weren't like fully updated or didn't know the language of my illness. It was very frustrating. So it kind of always feels like a miracle when you get better, when you get to that level of illness that I did, because it really didn't seem hopeful. And several times in my life, I've thought, well, now I guess I'm disabled for life and that I won't be able to take care of myself. And luckily, I've, come out of it. Partially, though, the thing that feels weird to say, because it seems like magical thinking in a way, is that like I've gotten better a few times, or the last time especially, because I've had to. Because the only alternative would have been to die. But that kind of sounds like ableism right there. It sounds like I'm saying to people like, well, you didn't have to get better, so you didn't. I don't want to say that exactly, but I do when people ask, like, especially because it was, again, very public, my last health crisis. They're like, how did you get better? It's like, I would have died if I didn't get better. Those were the options. but I don't know, that thing with me is I have a very strong will, and I will like will myself sometimes to like different tiers of help. But again, that it just sound very ableist to me, like otherwise. But I mean, I don't know. There's also this dimension of like, if you have like caretakers and you have lots of money to put into something, you can do things at a different pace, and you can also take less risks. Whereas several times I've had to just go for it. Like someone will tell me like, this is going to be really intense, but it's going to work. You just have to go through a lot of discomfort. Can you do it? And it's like, well, it sounds like I have to, because you're not giving me a choice B. And and many times doctors have looked me in the eye and just said, you don't have the finances for this other thing, so we're going to do this with you. I'm actually relieved to hear that, because it's like truth, it's honest. So it's like, okay, yeah, that's true. Like, I let doctors know very openly, because also they'll sometimes assume writers have more money than we do. So you're also dealing with like the artist economy here, and like misunderstandings around like a creative underclass. And so that also just causes, and they'll also assume Iranians are wealthy, or Muslim communities give lots of support. All these things are not really true in the end. So it's like, it's a mess. Or they'll assume because I have advanced degrees or whatever it is, I present as like, I don't know, privileged or like conventionally intelligent. I don't know what, that somehow, oh, it'll be more mental illness rather than physical, or
Oh man.
But I just am very challenging now, this stuff. I really think that like, especially like young women of color just need to be less like cooperative and more willing to be combative, actually. It really like hurts me to see the interactions sometimes. But I also see like just online when they're interacting with like a bully online, it's like, you're being so polite. Why? Whose benefit is that for? Who taught you that is how to be a woman in the world? Like, that's just garbage. And I regret every time in my life I cooperated with like abusive or toxic systems or things. So I just think this thing, and I think it actually is sort of disproportionately taught to us, like Asian women.
Oh yeah.
Is to like be like, good and like play along and like be like, don't rock the boat. But it's really a shame, because that attitude, I think, kills you more than it like benefits you. So
it's toxic. It's totally toxic.
Yeah, it's really horrible.
And like, I'm sure you face this, which is like, especially like, it's just never talked about, which is the PTSD kind of mental health side, which is just such a major crisis, especially of women of color. And and the thing is, it's used as a way to dismiss women of color, which I think is hideous. And so how have you maintained the balance for the mental health and the physical health side for yourself?
Well, it's funny because a lot of people have said to me that was like a risky move in the book, to talk so much about mental illness and to talk about the mind-body connection. But I was like, I felt ahead of that conversation, because I thought to deny that is ridiculous. So like, if we're still trying to say to people, oh, we need to be believed for our physical health mainly, well, that's like ableism too. Like, what's wrong with also talking? I mean, how can you not? First of all, I don't think everybody's mentally ill, but I do think if you go through certain types of health crises, you're going to at the very least have PTSD or CPTSD. I just don't think many people don't. I don't believe in perfect mental health, to be honest.
No. It's like physical health, isn't it?
Right. But it's like the same way I don't believe anyone's like fully straight, I just think it's like annoying of straight people always trying to act like they're like the majority. Whereas if we really got deep and everybody's like psychology, would probably see it as more of a spectrum. But so I don't, this is the whole thing with like mental illness. There's so much stigma, or there was. I think there's less now, but I think like, it's such a weird, like, do I identify as mentally ill? I don't really, because I don't like the way that sounds really, I just like, is that ableism? I may be, but I don't feel mentally incapacitated on a daily level. But I feel, yes, CPTSD, I think, is something I deal with all the time, or OCD, like very specific. I think with mental illness, it's important to be specific.
Yeah.
And I definitely identify strongly with those communities. And it's because it took me a long time to get those diagnoses too. Like, it was very unclear what was wrong with me mentally. But when I finally got to OCD and CPTSD, it really made a lot of sense for patterns in my life and like, you know, ways that I coped with things. And so, you know, those diagnoses should help you, not harm you, you know, and that's, I think, the issue here. It's just it is very complicated with ableism. The other thing that's very complicated that becomes an issue in my book too is like pharmaceuticals and like intervention with like mental illness. I wouldn't say that I'm anti-medication, but I would say I'm suspicious of some of it and the over diagnosis. I mean, that's like a problem in my book where I'm constantly given pills for different mental conditions. Nobody's very hesitant to do that with me. But that stuff, I also think like, you know, and I can already hear like some women of color not liking what I'm about to say, but I really do think like white people tend to do better with a lot of those meds. There's just more studies on them, especially white men. And I have very rarely taken a medication for my mental health that actually helped me. Usually I had all the side effects and it really messed me up. There have been times I needed the intervention in like an emergency scenario. But at the end of the day, like that world also, the world of like, you know, psychiatry, let's say, really actually harmed me quite a lot. And this caused a division with some of my friends. Some of my friends are really like, or former friends even, were very much like really like obsessed with psychiatry and like felt their psychiatrist had saved their lives. I just never had that experience. I felt that was a very fraught relationship always for me. And I felt that like there's no pill that was like a magic pill for me. Even there's a few I take now that I think are helpful, but they're not the thing that like brought me to stability. So that's also, so see, the taboos in the West run all over the place because there's a lot of people in the chronic illness communities that don't like people being critical of pharmaceutical drugs, or they'll think it immediately means you're one of those like extreme alternative health people that just believes in like yoga and prayer or something. That's not what I'm saying either. I just feel like, I don't know, there's no real like single community or single organization or single anything that like solved anything for me the way that like I did for me, you know, and just sitting and being like trying to figure out what works for me and being also brave enough to say like this thing might work for most of my friends, but it's not working for me. And that's fine, you know, that's just how it is. But I also just never really liked being in groups of people. I'm not like a club person or a pack person really. So I've seen a lot of like groups of like chronically ill and disabled women like enable each other in really weird ways, like in the same way of like popular girls in high school. Whenever I see groups like that, I always walk away. I don't like that sort of any sort of group mentality. I like to really sit with myself and ask myself like what is good for me and what works. And I don't like to like get swept up in any trends or like things like that. So
no, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, that's one of the only things I think in my personality. There's a lot of questioning authority and a lot of thinking outside of groups. That's always been helpful for me. It does make it's not, these are not like, you know, in America, I think these are a little bit like problem behaviors in a sense, but at the same time, you know, who cares? I think just always feeling like I didn't belong here actually ended up being good for me. And feeling that I come from a culture that, you know, the West actually kind of hates, in a way allowed me a space to say, okay, well, I'm not going to be accepted by you. I'm not going to be embraced. So I'm just going to like sit in this corner with my own identity and like really figure out what's right for me. And yeah, it's going to be lonely, but actually to me, loneliness is very low on the list of like horrible things you can go through in life.
Indeed.
It's very close to solitude. I mean, the truth is loneliness and solitude, yeah, they're different, but I've always been, even in my family, I was the odd one out. So I always found a way when I was alone to like make that productive or survive, you know, survivable in a way, so that I wasn't just like suffering, being excluded. I just found a way to create like a sense of peace in being shut out And that part of that was at a young age. I said, this thing I'm being shut out of, like, which was many things, like being cool in school. I was like, oh, what if I don't want that? What if I decided I don't want that? What if every time I see girls doing some trend or they're being applauded through their friends and I know I can't have that? What if I actually, again, it's kind of like being ahead of the discussion, right? What if I decided I never even wanted that? What if when the kids are going to school dances and I'm not allowed because of my strict parents, I decide that that wasn't cool. I don't want to go to school dances. And so I really remember consciously at a young age realizing the limitations I had in my household, like even with English, the second language, and then realizing like, oh, here's another way out. What if you decide, you make the conscious choice that that thing everybody thinks you want is not something you want? So that was really formative in my identity, and it's still sort of like a big part of my psyche. And it's really a way for me to survive. It does make it hard for me to maybe say like have meaningful like relationships or things, or even trust groups of people, because I've become so used to being on the outside, an outlier in almost every group that I'm in, so that I just am most comfortable being on the outside. And sometimes when I'm on the inside, I'm very like skittish, but you know.
Yeah, comparison culture is very harmful though. Like this is where perfectionism comes in, and you end up destroying yourself just by trying to aim to be like everyone else. So
right,
I think it's quite sensible to just actually just go away, do your own thing, be happy in your own solitude.
Yeah, if I mean, as brown women, like to be realistic is like if the odds are set up against us, which we know they are in a lot of different parts of like, you know, societies and whatever it is, you know, not always, but like, you know, there's very good evidence that there's discrimination against us. Fine. Say in our lifetime, it's never going to get to the point where we need it to get. What if we just said, okay, well, we don't even want to play the game. So you were like banking on us being a player at the table, but what if we were like, we don't even see the game. We're out, we're going to do this whole other thing about our happiness and our health. And we're going to prioritize ourselves in a way that's on our own terms, not on yours. And so that's just become like something I'm really like good at. And it just has become so deep for me that I truly don't relate to so many of the things that people want. For me really feels like in like truly an alien language where I'm just like, I forgot what I must have at some point wanted that, maybe like some stable life with like marriage and a home I owned and kids. Maybe I wanted that, but I don't remember that anymore as something I wanted. And I at 43 feel, you know, the best thing about my age and everything I've been through is like right now I feel very free. I don't feel rich. I don't feel like, you know, all these other things that might comfort people, but I feel very free.
That's the most
and
important
actually
thing.
That's difficult in this America, ironically, a place obsessed with freedom, but that like really gives people not that much, only a select few, like true freedom. So it's a real mentality you have to inhabit, that you have to fight for. It's not easy.
No. It was so interesting reading the idea of being unanchored, you know, a lot as a theme. And I was just wondering, did you feel dissociated or disconnected from your body growing up, from the time like when you first faced trauma and then through sickness and then obviously through drugs on top of that?
Yeah, it's funny because I only in recent years have really sat with the term disassociation. I didn't really totally understand what it meant. And then a good friend of mine said, well, yeah, of course you've done it a lot. That seems evident to me, and here and here and here. And it was almost like my Ehlers-Danlos diagnosis came from people reading Sick and asking me if I had it, and I didn't know I had it, but I did. But so it's sometimes people need to see it from the outside to identify it. But I think that that definitely was like part of the coping strategy, was like, I guess I did it so much since I was young that I didn't realize it was unusual, because I felt to do the opposite, to really immerse oneself in actual trauma as it's happening to me, just felt like that's like death, you know? So in order to survive, there had to be like a sort of level of disconnection. And like, you know, as I always just remember as a child, if you, I know most kids, most people, when you ask them to like envision what their childhoods are like, maybe they see themselves playing on a playground or, you know, I just remember closing the door to the room I shared with my brother. Usually he'd be in the living room with my parents, but just shutting the room, going in there and just burying myself in books and my writing, which I had a writing practice when I was in elementary school even. So I was very motivated and I had a very strong goal that was like way larger than my family. And I had just learned at that age that the dramas of my family life were going to be ongoing and that I had to separate from them in order to like create and find some sort of joy for myself, because I was very depressed as a child. So, and I knew that that feeling, I think I was very conscious of the fact that feeling could kill me ultimately. So I just remember at a very young age thinking, my God, how can someone endure all this to old age? You know, like, it seems like so much to live through. That's very sad that a child would think that, but at the same time, I didn't linger on like, oh, that's horrible. I had a lot of suicidal ideation, but the minute that would cross my mind, I would think, okay, what's the solution for getting through the day? So I had to really be my own parent in many ways. And my parents are not terribly sophisticated about physical or mental health. They still are not. And so that, you know, that was also very difficult to be like the oldest child who kind of has to like figure it all out for herself. And my brother didn't have like a lot of these issues. So he just, again, it was like just me like doing all this and dealing with all that.
And actually, I was wondering, how much connection do you think there is between the body and identity?
A lot, I think. It was so much that I don't know how to disconnect it, I guess. It's just more like the strategy, right? Like, I think there's almost a perfect connection, but then people, you have, like, for instance, I'm a compartmentalizer. The only way I know how to get through a day is by compartmentalizing, and sometimes very strict and like obsessive and intense ways. Somebody might say, I'm sure if I went to a certain psychiatrist, they'd say, well, that's not healthy. I just find so much of like Western psychiatry to be so provincial and ridiculous. And like now you have on the social media people trying to be each other's psychiatrists and tossing around like psychiatric terms, you know, to help each other. It's ridiculous. I find it really like, I mean, some of it's maybe good. People are making it more affordable or accessible to talk about certain issues, but I just feel like, because for me, like compartmentalization, it really works. And it's like actually like a very healthy way for me to deal with my work life on top of other things. But that to me is linked to like boundaries, like the ability to set certain boundaries and to respect them and to like, you know. So but I'm sure there's so many things about my life that like so many people like a life coach or people like that would find unhealthy, but I don't feel compelled to change it because it's been working for me. I mean, maybe it could get better, I'm sure, but it's like, I just, at this age now, I'm just like, I don't know, why would I change it really? Like, yeah, I do think about dramatically changing some things here and there, but at the same time, I bump up against limitations again of like my own identity. And we're not there in any of our cultures to like really embrace people with all my identifiers. So what am I going to do? Again, wait for the culture to catch up? Well, I just don't think it's going to in my lifetime. I think we've made some progress, though, for sure, especially in the last like decade, right? But I don't think it's really where it should be, actually. And so I'm not really going to wait for it.
No.
So I'm just going to find ways to survive, even while realizing it's unfortunate that such and such is the way it is, you know.
Sad, but it's true. And
I'm very practical. That's the thing. I think a lot of artists are not. And I actually, at the end of the day, I'm pretty practical about things. So like writing a book for me, when people are like, how did you do it? I'm just like, well, I saw like, you know, a book is like, say like 300 pages and like, I wrote it in like 10 parts, 30 pages each. I just basically distribution of plot over some numbers. It's like how you write a book. Not different than like the reliance on numbers when you're baking. It's actually very similar to baking in that like people want it to be this glamorous, mystical process. It's like inspired and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, you have to be just really good at like precision and numbers and following directions, really. And you're setting your own rules maybe with a book like that, but you just have to really stick to it. And so I just see it in a very practical sense. I don't really like, I think because I also, I'm someone who believes in God, I'm Muslim, I don't really like the adoption of like mystical language for like art. I think there's some of that, of course, but I think it's like a bit heavy-handed for like a job.
No, that makes sense. And actually, I thought it was really interesting because I remember reading, obviously from where you started, and just almost like fleeing Iran. And I was just wondering, like, what do you think the consequences were when you were told that your home was temporary all the time?
That what was temporary?
That your home was temporary.
Oh yeah, I think that's probably was like very formative, major thing because, I think a lot of people who are like refugees, have a very hard time with the idea of like settling somewhere. And so for me, like, for instance, like moving, I just moved apartments again. I was like, for a second it was overwhelming, but then I was like, oh, I know how to do this. Like, this is something I've been doing since I was a child, and it actually felt comforting in a way. Like me having packed bags and going from place to place feels so natural. And I've moved so many times within New York City and like all these other, like, I've rarely lived in one place for, like, I think the apartment I had in Harlem was the longest I lived in one place, which is like 6 or 7 years. So I just am constantly like on the go in a way that I think has a lot to do with those early refugee years. So impermanence, right? In a way you could say that's like instability, but at the same time, I think it's actually like, not to get too philosophic, but that's like life, right? You really embracing impermanence is like, for instance, a major Buddhist tenet, so like, that's really like, I think, a good way to look at this world, that we're all visitors and we're here temporarily, and then like then we exit. So I think on a larger sense it's good, but I do have like commitment phobias still, in like my 40s. I feel that I'm just by default commitment phobic, and it's really hard for me to put down roots somewhere, even though I like, I'm like just moved again. I'm constantly thinking about like moving to Asia again and like just starting a different life, and I will always be that person that the minute things look settled, I'll think, what if this was different? That was actually a hard thing. There's a lot of like relationships described in Sick, but I think one of the things that an underlying issue in all those relationships was that or like you say, pre-existing condition to those relationships was that I personally was not like that willing to, really settle into them the way maybe some other people would, that I was like willing to let the thing fall apart, or I was looking at the exit door, so it's just that's not a great thing, but it's just how it is, I guess. And I think it's just anybody who is like a refugee or migrant or whatever you want to call it has to accept that, like especially those with children, they have to accept that that will really affect how their children walk through the world. And usually it's not a decision you make lightly. When you make those big life choices, there's no other choice for my family. So that wasn't ideal. It would have been better if like we could have just lived in Iran and I'd had this other stable life. But there's so much trauma in my first few years of life, whether it was the moving or just like actual wartime, and then the alienation in America, and like so much of the anti-Iranian sentiment here. So that's I don't wish that on any but young person, or any person really, period. But it was definitely highly formative. I think people also realize that about me when they see I critique like the white West or white America pretty harshly often. But that's because I saw its ugliest sides at a young age, personally. And then I saw my communities, Black communities, brown communities, all these communities around me in Los Angeles suffer in these very vivid ways. I lived like 10 miles outside where the center of the LA riots was. And I remember very vividly that day, and the smoke in the air and the tensions and all that stuff. And like, I got like in trouble in school, because I was defending the rioters. And like, it was just seeing the effects of like white supremacy, anti-blackness, anti-brownness, Islamophobia. It was so everywhere. So, anytime someone is like, says that to me, I'm like, well, that's how I grew up. And also I grew up in a white minority school, a white minority community. So I was 18 at a liberal arts school on the East Coast. The first time I was in a room with majority white people, the absolute first time I was in a room with majority white people. I didn't know that was possible in America. They were affluent white people that I'd had no interactions with.
Right. This was Sarah Lawrence, wasn't it?
Yeah, Sarah Lawrence, which was then known as like one of the richest school, the most expensive school rather in the country. So I got there on a scholarship. That's why they were able to give really big scholarships. And I got there and I was like, oh, wow. And I still remember like wearing very like suburban LA, like uniform. The first day of school, I was wearing like a baseball cap and like tank top and jean cutoff shorts and Pumas. And I thought that's like a normal thing you'd wear to like school. And then these white girls with their designer clothes that I'd never even heard of. And I was just like blown away, but also a little horrified. And I don't think it was a coincidence that was a very difficult school for me and probably the wrong choice. But at the same time, it sort of solidified actually something that I'd grown up thinking was that like, I think big groups of rich white people are probably really problematic. And they were. And that they would be so problematic in that they not only would not serve me, they wouldn't serve themselves. And so, when I started seeing like friend groups of mine be like traumatized by, say, suicides and drug overdoses and like just constant bad decisions and like all that, at a very young age, I was losing friends. No one should have to be like 19 and then think about like your friend dying. So that was happening a lot with Sarah Lawrence in that era. That was very much like the end of the heroin chic era and all that 90s stuff. And we were very much in the heart of it in that point. And so that was also a big wake up call because I had thought, oh, if only I leave my little LA suburb on the East Coast, everything must be better. They have like cool artists and and like they're very educated there. And like, it maybe is, I actually thought it would be more diverse, hilariously, but New York was, but not the college that I was in. So that was very startling. And then when I went to grad school, it was very similar too, whereas like Johns Hopkins is actually fairly diverse, but in my writing program was not so much. And so I was the one person of color in our fiction cohort, which is really crazy to imagine. So, and then Chimamanda Adichie came the year after me.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so then you had this like amazing Black writer like there, but in our fiction cohort there was nothing, and then there was some in the other groups, but very few.
So crazy.
Yeah, that's why you see her in our names very proudly in their like brochure. They got to get the women of color there.
Indeed, the nice tokenism, isn't it? And I was actually wondering, after all of this, would you say you've come to terms and accepted your body inside and out?
No. That's not a good answer, but that's the truth. Oh, I'm always so honest, but which doesn't always serve me, but I don't feel that I trust my body ever or feel at peace in it because it's just like this weekend I went away for like the first time during the pandemic. Really, I went to see a friend of mine in Philadelphia, and I remember thinking there's one moment where I felt a little sick because I was eating whatever I wanted and going out late at night and having a really nice time, but I thought, oh shit, I'm feeling dizzy in this one way that I know has a lot to do with my blood sugar and my blood pressure. I have severely low blood pressure and very low blood sugar as well, and the combination there causes a lot of issues, sometimes related to my POTS, sometimes related to some diabetic conditions. But anyways, I had a moment of panicking a little bit, being away from home and not totally equipped with how to deal. And I realized, oh, okay, well, this is just something I'm going to have to remember to live with, because this is what life was like right before the pandemic. I would go out and think, oh no, here's this old familiar feeling. So I think the problem is my health advanced to such a point that even if I'm not in a flare, my body is still dealing with things that other people's bodies are not. So I think I'm past the point of really striving for like perfect health.
Yeah.
But, and so I think that just means that like I will have a distance from my body often, or lack of trust, or in its ability to survive. But again, I think that goes back to that sort of impermanence comment, where it's like, well, what, the fabric of life is such that we can't really trust any of it, because at any given moment, anything can happen, right? So it's like, I don't know. Is it good to live with some degree of commitment phobia about life? Maybe the Buddhists would say yes, actually. So I don't know. I feel like I'm always ready for something to go wrong, but that's very immigrant too. Like that's very
So
like
true.
American immigrants, or I think everybody, any immigrant group, like always doesn't trust the dominant culture of where they're at. I always feel suspicious of America. I always feel suspicious of white Americans or white Westerners. I always feel like my best interests are not in the conversation here. And I can laugh at that, or I can just again like find a way to like exist outside of that and just make my own rules. But I do think it's like kind of a weird way to live, or like just to cope with the day to day. It's not very comfortable, I guess. But I don't really know what it is like to be otherwise. I guess I very rarely in my life have I experienced like a feeling of full comfort. I've always been burdened by some feeling of like being on edge.
Yeah. That's tough. It's tough because
Yeah.
you've got nothing to kind of compare it with.
No, I can see that like a level of ease that like certain rich white people have, and I'm like, that's interesting, because I don't know what that's like. But I also think it's not necessarily the worst for artists to be like this, because first of all, the outsider thing is always good for an artist to have some degree of, but also like to really have to constantly look critically at things is good for an artist. The questioning is good. I know some writers, and some of them are even women of color, who question very little.
Yeah.
I really don't understand that sort of brain for what we do. Like it's the way that certain people don't want to relate to activism or find it hostile or something. I just don't see how you can be of like a certain group or identity and really not want to participate in its questioning or dismantling certain harmful like systems. The complacency is weird to me.
Yeah, completely. And I actually wanted to ask you, like, how do you use your platform now then to kind of make it different for other people, and maybe provide a role model kind of outlook to others?
Yeah, well, I'm extremely online always, which is sometimes a pain, but I think it's important because I learned that form of activism when I was disabled and chronically ill at my worst with all that. I couldn't really go anywhere. I was just bedridden. So I'd have to do it all through my phone in bed. So I realized the value of that actually, and how important that is, especially in COVID. It's like obviously very important. I still will try at times to sometimes physically be there. But then there's another type of activism that doesn't get talked about a lot that I engage in the most, probably. And it's sort of like privately helping people.
Yes.
You don't really get credit for it. But it also, I feel like a lot of brown people, especially like I think of Muslim culture doing this a lot, where you sort of just, is part of your culture to help. It's part of your culture to overextend. And in fact, there's not a lot of boundaries and stuff there. So there's all this Western talk of boundaries, or like, don't give too much. Like, it's ridiculous. It doesn't like vibe at all with like Muslim culture at all. And so, there's a lot of like pretty much every single day I'm in touch with somebody who's in real need. And it's always that I'm figuring out either like funding for them or housing or how to connect them with like other resources. There's always something like that going on. Usually there's like several, like right now I can think of 4 people in my orbit that I'm trying to help actively every day. So every free time I have, it doesn't really go to my own leisure, but it really goes into me like sort of troubleshooting or like trying to like get them to some sort of safety or stability. That I think is going to continue to be a very potent form of activism. It's just not one that you can like if you're very ego driven or whatever it is, you're not going to get credit online all the time for it. And some people will even say, well, you're not doing anything. The people who know, and it's like, who are you doing it for? To get a bunch of likes online? Like, who cares? Such a low goal there. So I do a lot of that sort of stuff, which is very under the radar, like even to the point where I want, if I'm helping somebody who's marginalized in some way, I don't want to really get credit for it. I want them to get credit for it. So I'm putting them, rightfully ahead in a way that I know will serve them. And that takes a lot of like navigating and understanding one's privilege and power and how to like serve others. So that's really important to me and really tied to like my own religious background. That's like the thing.
Well, it looks like that you do have a cohesive identity if you are doing those things, because those are your values, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I think like in terms of our societies, like we should all be doing more, not less. There's a weird rhetoric these days of like, do less. And it's like help people less. And it's like, I feel like actually like, our ancestors would look and say, you guys do very little for others.
Yeah, definitely.
Like I can't imagine the sort of villages my grandmothers grew up in, people being like talking about their boundaries and like rest more, like don't do. This thoughts never crossed the mind of people from where I'm from.
Yeah.
So it's just the fragility, especially of like white people in the West, is really comical. They'll do the bare minimum and want to be applauded for that. It's just I don't trust it and I'm not interested in it. It's pathetic, really. I guess they know their limits, but if that's actually useful information. If that is really your limit, then you really are capable of very little and you should not be called on to help. Therefore, you should not be put into these certain positions of power. You actually are very, very little as a human being. That needs to be looked at critically. So we need to not rely on you. Therefore, it doesn't make sense that you and your people are in power. Because you're saying that you actually don't have the intellectual prowess, the spiritual depth, the emotional know-how. You're saying your capacity is extremely shallow. Then I don't understand, because guess what? My people know we can do a lot more. We can almost always do more than you and still have more to give. And you see evidence of that in the third world, where people will literally have the bare minimum of food on their table, but they'll still have extra to give to someone. Always. They will be at the depths of poverty, but they will always, I saw this in really poor neighborhoods in Indonesia that I was visiting, Muslim, of course. And I mean, these were some of the most impoverished people, and they still would invite you to their house. Or I saw this in Palestine, invite you over in a cave, and there's still like food that they have to give you, and they want to share that with you, and they want to say, how can I help you? That's just like that's the worlds that we come from. So it's very, I think, violent when you then encounter what there is in the West, where it's like, well, we've got plenty, but we're not sharing it, and we're not really extending, and our privacy and our selfhood or individualism is everything. And it's like I just think we have to embrace it all the more, that we come from places that are community minded, and like in an emergency, I think people are now seeing the Muslim world always knows what to do. They're always at the top of the game with fundraisers, You see this with all, I think with Asians, Africans, all of it, South Americans, you see all the time, like there's a massive crisis and these communities know how to deal with it. Whereas they might not have the same money or power that these other, white communities would in those things, but they're actually, the white communities are at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
So they don't know how to be there for their communities.
Yeah. Welcome to capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
Survival of the fittest.
Yeah, but it's like, if you're not resourceful with like the money, then it doesn't really go anywhere. Whereas I think so many of our people like can make do with so little and have such rich lives with so little. And that's really like survival right there. Like that's beautiful to me. I don't really want a lot. I just want to continue to have the ability to, with very little, make something of that. And find joy and peace from that.
Definitely. Yeah.
In Western society, capitalism is God, right? God is money. So, but it's very clear, I think, to people now, the limitations of that way of thinking. It's like, there's so many, as a writer, I just think there's so many cautionary tales around that. How can they be so stupid to stumble right into the heart of that sort of evil? But there's no real like morality. I can't tell you how often, to me, a cursed culture is this, that when I say God bless you, they see that as like harmful. And unfortunately, sadly, the white American right, like now thinks they can say God bless. They have like a monopoly on like God, which is really disgusting because I hate those people. But the fact is, like, the fact that in America, if I say God bless you to someone, they see that as a harmful statement that's just cursed. The energy is so cursed. This is the sort of shit the ancestors warned about. It's like these people are that cursed that they can't hear the word God.
Yeah.
And that really is a definition of a people that are really deeply morally and spiritually sick. So then what do you have? A bunch of money to separate that? Because I should recoil at the mention of money.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's really messed up culture. So,
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. And God, Porochista, love this so much, so much. It's such a nice, it's so true that these are such important conversations to be had. And especially now, as you say, where like COVID is going to like disproportionately affect so many people, especially people of color,
right.
and long COVID as well, on top of everything.
Totally.
Yeah, these are conversations that need to constantly be had. Discussion of ableism, things like that as well. So huge thank you for speaking with me today. And again, really can't wait to read all your other ones as well, your new collections of books as well.
Thanks so much. It's so lovely talking to you.